After the death of my brother, seeing, that he had received chemotherapy and lived barely 11 months, a feeling that can we do better? Can we find a way to treat cancer that is effective but without side effects? Every single measure we were doing, there was a benefit to the patient, and that's why we received FDA approval in 2023.
Where is AI doing useful, meaningful work for you and Karmanos right now?
You can improve the characterization or the likelihood of the lesion being benign versus malignant. You may avoid a lot of unnecessary death from cardiovascular disease just by using an AI recognition of a pattern. It's a fascinating field of development and potential applications.
The standard playbook for treating cancer hasn't changed much in decades. Surgery, radiation, chemotherapy, drugs with real toxicity. My guest today spent the better part of 20 years building something that works entirely differently. Dr. Boris Pasche is the president and CEO of Karmanos Cancer Institute in Detroit and chair of oncology at Wayne State University School of Medicine. He's a physician scientist who discovered a foundational cancer gene early in his career and then spent 2 decades developing TheraBionic, a new device authorized by the FDA in 2023. Dr. Pasche now runs one of the country's largest NCI-designated cancer networks, an institution with a long track record of being the first. We talk about holding on to conviction and seeing a journey through 2 decades of work. We talk about the concern over guidelines not making it to the patient, in one specific case that could have gone quite the wrong way. And then we dig into where AI is doing real work in oncology right now. Dr. Pasche, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for the opportunity, Matt.
Before we dive into the science, I'd love to kind of start with you. You're a practicing oncologist, a cancer center leader, an inventor. I love, if you can kind of share with how all those threads kind of came together for you and your journey.
So my journey began when I was a medical student and I lost my brother to acute myeloid leukemia. I was 23, he was 21. And this was probably one of the most painful events in my life. We were very close. We were both studying medicine and I lost him. So I think cancer in a way was something that I was quite afraid of, that I was very sensitive to. And I remember that as a medical student, a few months later, I met a young pediatric patient that was dying of osteosarcoma, and he told me, am I going to die? And I remember it overwhelmed my emotions, and I felt that cancer was something I could not do. I continued my studies in Sweden. I obtained my MD and my PhD at Karolinska Institute, and then moved to the US with the intention to continue in the field of my PhD, which was coagulation research. I had been working on novel artificial surfaces, and while at Harvard, I worked on receptors on the platelets that were responsible for coagulation, and identified the first impact of thrombolysis on platelet receptors. Thereafter, I moved to New York to start my internship and residency in internal medicine with a plan to continue in that field. And fate has it that one of my first rotation was on the leukemia ward at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. And there I found myself as a young intern signing death certificates every night. I was on call for young people like my brother that were dying of refractory leukemia. And that was really a very traumatic experience. I remember crying many times. And one morning I realized this is really affecting me so profoundly. This is where I should go. I should not go into coagulation, but I should go into cancer. Then I started to interview with different groups that were doing cancer research. And the rest is history. I moved into oncology.
So let's get right into your work with TheraBionics. For folks that may not know the story, the results were truly groundbreaking. Tell us about the path that you took from taking it from an idea to an FDA-approved device.
That was really a dream of my, I would say, late 20s, when after the death of my brother, seeing, that he had received chemotherapy, had lived barely 11 months, a feeling that can we do better? Can we find a way to treat cancer that is effective but without side effects? And during all these years that I had trained in Europe and in the US, I always had a keen interest on alternative medicine and different approaches to look at the human body. And in 1984, 85, I met a gentleman in France who was not a physician, he was a DO, and working mostly on alternative medicine to identified ways to treat people. And fate has it also that my father at that time was interested in new businesses and had found this gentleman in my hometown in Lausanne that was supposedly treating a stress with radiofrequency electromagnetic fields. They were putting actually a rod inside the nose of patients, a metallic rod, and then were coupling that to a device that were emitting radio frequencies and claimed that they did, have an impact on stress. So at that time, I was a student at Karolinska Institute in Stockholm, and I said, well, this is interesting, but we need studies to find out whether it works. And together with this French gentleman, Alexandre Barbeau, we started to look into this device and realized that first, the device seemed to be fairly simple, but the mode of application was dangerous. You didn't want people to have a piece of metal going into their nose. It was essentially it was long before COVID. That was like COVID test, like getting something put deep inside your nose, which is, I don't know many people who have enjoyed that experience, and I had it multiple times. So we looked into whether we could use another approach, and the spoon inside the mouth was actually giving you a better contact because you had contact between the spoon and the whole tongue. And it was not dangerous. I mean, it was like holding a spoon in your mouth. Who has ever been harmed by having a spoon in their mouth? So suddenly it became clear we could do that. When I was a fellow at Sloan Kettering doing my training as an oncologist and realizing, well, all the drugs we're using in oncology are so much more toxic. When you look at many of the drugs used for the treatment of breast cancer, many of them cause secondary cancer because they damage the DNA. Many of the antibodies we're using were causing side effects. And I say suddenly, who would be concerned about low level of radiofrequency electromagnetic fields when you're treating a deadly disease that is already treated with many drugs that are so toxic? So suddenly it dawned on me, why not try to see whether we can identify frequencies that could be used for the treatment of cancer?
Wow, there's definitely some courage there to make that leap.
Very bold thinking based on previous experience that this was doable for patients, but also realizing that in oncology, that could be a Trojan horse. We would be able to attack the tumor in a way that is very different. So following this, I reconnected with this French gentleman, Alexandre Barbeau, and would fly over the Atlantic over the weekend and see patients with him and examine them for changes in pulses when we expose them to these frequencies. And two things became very clear early on. The frequencies we were finding in patients with cancer were totally different from the frequencies we identified in patients with insomnia or anxiety. They were higher and they were more narrow, if you wish. So we worked closely with the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, used a novel technology called DDS that allowed for very precise modulation of a signal. And doing this, we started to get answers to several questions. First, we noticed that patients with a diagnosis of cancer responded to always the same frequencies when they had the same tumor type. So let's say you had a 75-year-old woman with stage 4 breast cancer or a 27-year-old woman with stage 2 breast cancer, we found exactly the same changes in pulse when exposed to the same frequencies. We then expanded that to other tumor types and found that for all tumor types, there was a majority of frequencies that were only found in these tumor types. There were a few frequencies that were common to multiple tumor types, but the majority appeared to be very specific. So in 2009, we published these first results, the examination of patient, and then we started a feasibility study in Lausanne, Switzerland, my hometown. To our surprise, we had several major responses. One patient was stage 4 breast cancer with metastasis to the left femur and to the right adrenal gland, had a complete response. The tumor melted away. So obviously I was collecting all the CT, brought them back to the US, had my colleagues in the US review the imaging. And I remember very well Dr. Reggie Munden, who was a former vice chair of radiology at MD Anderson, who had become the chair of radiology at UAB, which was my new institution by the time we were ready to publish this data. I'd say, Boris, but there is no more tumor. It disappeared entirely. And he said, what have you done? And I say, well, we used this device. And he said, that's a very impressive response. And it lasted 11 months. We had another patient also with stage 4 breast cancer who had a partial response. So not the whole tumor decreased, but more than 30% decrease in the volume of the tumor. It's called a partial response. And it lasted for 13 months. And in both cases, these were patients that were not taking any other medication against their cancer. So suddenly we got a clear information this may work in cancer. Two things we learned also. There was a systemic effect since it could shrink the femoral bone on the left side, the adrenal gland on the right side, and it was working both in bones and in soft tissue.
Okay, so you have something. Where do you go from there?
So this information helped us to really understand that this theoretical approach of delivering radiation through the entire body with radio waves was feasible and worked. So that one thing led to another one. One of my former colleagues from Sloan Kettering had moved back to his native country in Brazil and called me up and said, listen, this is so exciting. Can we do that in liver cancer? We have so many liver cancer in Brazil. And he had become, by that time, the leader of clinical research at one of the largest transplant centers in Sao Paulo, where they had about 400 patients on the waiting list for a liver transplant. And of course, many patients that were enrolled in other clinical studies. So together, we designed an investigator-initiated study on 41 patients, and it was a two-set. We said, well, if the first 18 patients or 19 patients do well, which means we can show that the growth of the tumor stops and they have no side effect, then we'll go to the second phase, the 41. And very quickly, we saw results we didn't expect. Some patients that had very advanced liver cancer, suddenly the tumor stopped growing, and some patients started to shrink. That was quite interesting because this study was done in parallel with the registration study of sorafenib, the first drug that received FDA approval for advanced hepatocellular carcinoma. What we found in that among the 40 plus patients they had enrolled in the sorafenib study, not a single one had shrinking of the tumor. They lived slightly longer, they had side effects, and in the 41 patients we treated in Sao Paulo, 4 of them had significant tumor shrinkage. So suddenly we saw this is really working.
Wow, so now you got some really interesting data back. Now it's time to start manufacturing the device. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
First, that the device was easy to handle. It could be done at home. That's not something we wanted to change. But that the physician wanted to know actually how many hours did the patient use the device. We were trusting them to let us know, yes. So there was a questionnaire they would fill in and say, we have used it 3 hours, but we had no way to verify. It's like the pill count when you do clinical trial with pills. You hope that they are correct, but if the patient threw half of the pill in the toilet, you will never know. So we worked with a very smart engineer in Germany that said, well, we can verify that. We can measure the impedance of the line while we treat the patient. And by measuring the impedance, you can make sure that you know that the spoon is still in the mouth. And what he did was to adjust the impedance of the device in such a way that it would stop as soon as it felt that the spoon fell off or the contact was not good. So that was the first improvement. Second, physician told us we want to know how much we prescribe and how much is used. And there, with the impedance, we could, of course, measure reliably how many hours were used, but we had no way if we gave infinite number of treatments to make sure the patient came back and to make sure that the physician knew what happened. So that's when we developed the chip card. The chip card is an activation card that allowed us to upload a certain number of treatments and know that these, let's say 93 hours, were uploaded on that day, and you expect that by 1 month you will need another chip card. So that was a second major improvement. Third major improvement was safety concern. The device we were using was connected directly to the mains for charging, and then you would disconnect during treatment. But it did not remove the fact that the same device had both an outlet for the mains and an outlet for the spoon. So our German engineer, Hans-Peter Volpel, very smartly, who had done many medical devices in the past, said, I suggest we separate the device from the charging station, the docking station. So that's why we separated in 2 units, the docking station being connected to the mains, but the device never, ever being connected to the mains and being powered by a small 5-volt battery, which from a regulatory point of view, put that device in a very low-risk category. And indeed, when we received our first approval in Europe, it was a Class 2A device, which is the same class as electronic toothbrush, reflecting the fact that indeed for patient, the risk was very low.
So I know from our last conversation, the last step is getting the actual FDA approval. And, that has its own kind of time window in which, you're communicating back and forth with the FDA. And how long did that actually take?
Between 2019 and 2023, we had a very large number of exchange with the FDA where we communicating all the data we had. When they asked for additional information, it became clear looking at the data that the patient receiving treatment benefited from treatment, both in terms of survival, absence of side effects, and that whichever comparison was done, there was always a benefit. So that was very helpful. The last question that the FDA asked before granting us approval is, how well do patients do once they've received 2 lines of therapy and only receive treatment with a TheraBionic device? And to our surprise, even though it was a small number of patients, it was 9.15 months, which was a good 50% longer than you would expect. So every single measure we were doing, there was a benefit to the patient, and that's why we received FDA approval in 2023.
It's such a fascinating story to start from, seeing a metal rod into someone's mouth to actually start seeing data about how it's actually impacting tumor growth and getting all the data back. It's been such a long journey for you. And I think it speaks to, a lot of kind of the lost art of medicine where people are experimenting with new therapies. And it just goes to show like how much more is out there that we don't know yet.
Yes.
It's really exciting. I'm curious, with the data that we're getting back, one of the things that we talked about was like, if you have data that's so good, does it make sense to kind of accelerate whether or not a therapy should kind of become part of the guidelines, get into real treatment? ASCO, we had a really seminal results from the RA salute for that trial that came out. How can we accelerate these therapies to get them to patients sooner and do it in a very safe way?
Sure. And I think that's exactly where TheraBionic and this technology is right now. So we have our first indication. We have several trials ongoing. So a post-approval study, which is ongoing, that already has 31 patients enrolled and with already some major success stories. One patient is now entering its 19th month on therapy with TheraBionic after failing 2 lines of therapy. And we are seeing also that some drugs seem to be great combination with TheraBionic, while some other block the effect of the therapy. How did we discover that? Because we identified in the lab where the frequencies are demodulated and trigger this impact on tumor cells. It's actually a calcium channel called the CAV 3.2 T-type calcium channel, also called CACNA1H. And we found that some drugs that block this receptor entirely block the effect of the frequencies. So we then looked for drugs that are FDA approved that could bind to this receptor and found that quite a few do block this. One that surprised us was Cialis, which has nothing to do with cancer, which is used for erectile dysfunction. And Cialis completely blocks this effect because it binds to this CAV 3.2. Interestingly, its predecessor, Viagra, has no effect because it doesn't bind to the receptor. So we presented this data at the annual meeting of the American Association for Cancer Research, and actually requested a relabeling of the instruction manual by the FDA, which we received 10 days ago. And they said, yes, we agree with that. So we are now listing which drug should not be used and which drug could be used together with this treatment. So we are fast forward now, having identified a novel approach to treat cancer, refining its mechanism of action, realizing that now that we have the receptor, we can better understand how to combine this approach with already approved drugs, and also expand into both second line for hepatocellular carcinoma. We have treated now 40 patients on trial with stage 4 pancreatic cancer, and all the results are not as good as the one with daraxonrasib presented at ASCO. They're actually the best ever reported in stage 4 pancreatic cancer, short of this one. So suggesting that there is an impact, and it could be combined either with daraxonrasib or be used after daraxonrasib or other KRAS inhibitors, since we know that these KRAS inhibitor prolong life, but most patients become refractory after a certain time. So right now we have at Karmanos multiple studies ongoing. The pancreatic study that is ongoing both at Wake Forest and Karmanos. We have a study in colon cancer where it's combined with a drug used for third line called fruquintinib, and 12 patients have already been enrolled, with some patients showing very impressive responses. And we're starting now trial in breast cancer, but it's too early to report anything. So yes, this is really the phase where this technology is now, is to move to the next stage. And we're raising funds to precisely accelerate the development and distribution of this technology, which is really one major advantage that we hear from all patients. I have no side effects. And patients tell you that, yes, they don't always like to spend 3 hours a day sucking a lollipop, but they have no side effect. They play golf, they travel, they go on cruise, they don't have any drop in blood counts, and it's extremely well tolerated. And when they see the scan, either showing shrinkage of the disease or stable disease, of course, they are extremely excited, because for most of them, they were told that these were their last chance.
Yeah. I mean, Karmanos has, a huge history of being early, right? I think you guys were the first to do immunotherapy for melanoma. And, being first is really how medicine really advances, right? But
That is correct.
I think it also asks, patients and the physicians to kind of live with a certain amount of uncertainty. How do you decide when, being early is actually the responsible thing to do, or, when is it too much or too much risk to actually take on?
So I think, the US is an extremely well codified way to proceed with clinical trial, where I think risk and benefit are always very well handled. For oncology, the benefit for patients to enroll in studies or use novel technologies, it gives them another options. I've seen patients at Karmanos that have been on 8 different studies. And frequently, these patients were the first to receive immunotherapy, the first to receive a TKI, the first to receive a theranostic. And by enrolling in these studies, they probably would be dead if they had not enrolled, because they were early beneficiaries of a novel technology. So in a center like Karmanos, which has been indeed a leader in novel therapies for decades, you see that the whole staff, all physicians, all nurses are geared toward what can we do? What can we do better? How can we offer better options to our patients? And I think this mentality transcends really the whole approach to treatment of cancer, knowing that if you have an incurable disease and you know what the standard of care is, it's there. But if you can add something in between, instead of, or in addition to, this is what's going to give you longer survival, better quality of life, and potentially in some patients control the disease for a very long period of time.
Yeah. And I think taking that patient-centric approach is the right one, right? Ultimately, it comes down to giving the options to the patients and hearing their story. It's amazing to see how much, oncology is evolving, all the new therapeutics that are coming out, all the new devices that are coming out. But still, one of the things that I notice is there's this gap between, the science that exists and the care that's actually delivered in the bedside. And when we last spoke, you told me about a really interesting case of a young patient with stage 4 colon cancer. I'm curious if you can kind of share that story with the audience, and kind of just talk about the importance of not just advancing the science of oncology, but also making sure that that science gets to the bedside and to the patients.
Yeah, I think this history is really something that impacted me profoundly and impacted my colleagues also profoundly. It was uh, of course, going to keep all this anonymous, but let's say a 45 to 50-year-old man who had been treated at another institution for a rectal cancer, which is a fairly common disease. He had received the standard of care, which is chemoradiation therapy, followed by radiation therapy, followed by surgery, and had a recurrence of his disease. What we knew from the get go is that the genetic makeup of his disease made it very likely to respond to immunotherapy. At no point had he been offered immunotherapy. And the disease had progressed. He had received some additional chemotherapy and was sent home to hospice. He came to Karmanos for a second opinion. And I saw him and I reviewed the data and I said, well, where is the immunotherapy? When did you receive immunotherapy? I don't see. Say, oh, we never received immunotherapy. Was this ever discussed? Say, yes, one doctor said, but so it would not be appropriate for you. And I say, okay, why? And this patient was really in a very weak condition, on a wheelchair, had two young children. His wife was a nurse, so well versed with medical knowledge. And I said, we need to really treat you with immunotherapy. And the patient was admitted in the hospital. And usually you don't give immunotherapy for inpatient. It's a problem of reimbursement, of acceptance. So I had to really twist arms at Karmanos to get authorization to treat him while he was inpatient. Fortunately, he was able to get his first treatment, and it was last December. We continued treatment with every other week immunotherapy. He skipped one because he was rehospitalized, had so many complications from his disease. And suddenly, within 2 months, the tumor started to shrink. And within 4 months, the tumor had almost melted away. So this was a patient that was essentially sent home to die, had not received, I would say, the best standard of care. And when offered the proper standard of care, suddenly the situation turned around. So we're not talking about funerals, we're talking about long-term survival. We're talking about reversing all the deconditioning, the malnutrition, and other things. And the patient was seen just a couple of weeks ago, and it's a transformed individual. And I would say, as an oncologist and somebody who has seen many iteration of novel technology, an immense gratification that you really change the life of a patient using standard of care that had not been applied to him before. And it's not unusual. The novel technologies sometimes take years before they are broadly accepted. And in that case, it was lucky for him that he sought a second opinion and was able to benefit with his life, really, with the survival of a novel technology that had been in use for already several years, but that some physician may not use appropriately.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a powerful case on, how it's not just important to advance the science, but make sure that all the physicians that are actually treating patients, are able to actually deliver the care, the standard of, the care that the patient should be receiving. And I think it just becomes increasingly hard, right? I think with how quickly the guidelines are changing, with how quickly new therapies are coming to market, it's almost kind of surpassing the point of, human cognition, right? You kind of, just hope that the person who is caring for that patient is kind of keeping up with everything. It's a really good segue to, our next topic of AI, right? Like, there's no shortage of noise about AI in medicine, right? Like, I think at Karmanos, you run, a really research intensive cancer center with hundreds of trials and one of the most diverse patient populations in the country. So I think you see both sides of it, right? Both the promise and also the friction of implementing, these new AI tools. Where is AI kind of doing useful, meaningful work for you and Karmanos right now?
So I think in several aspects in radiology, we see rapid implementation of AI to recognize pattern. For example, when it comes to screening of patients for, let's say, breast cancer with mammography, we know that mammography is notoriously inaccurate in terms of it's helpful. It decreases slightly the risk of dying from breast cancer, but the interpretation of imaging is sometimes operator dependent. We see that with AI having a large number of images that were proven positive versus proven negative, you can improve the characterization or the likelihood of the lesion being benign versus malignant. And there, I think we are already seeing some benefits. Several studies have been published showing the benefit of AI. Another area was AI, which is really AI is machine learning, is essentially feeding a computerized model pattern and telling that these patterns reflect this, whereas other reflect that, and finding out whether the AI is capable of predicting what a new image will have. So another area where images are immensely helped by AI would be pathology. Sometimes you see a biopsy that is equivocal, where pathologists will discuss whether this is truly a tumor, whether it's pre-tumor, and what grade it is. And we see that in pathology, the implementation of AI is helping providing a more accurate diagnosis. And there are multiple applications, multiple companies working on that. But I think this is another area where we are seeing immediate benefit of AI in terms of pattern of recognition. When you come to treatment of patients with established cancer, like this patient I mentioned, it's clear that the day we can have AI integrating the finding of the genetic makeup of the tumor with clear guideline, in that case, you should use immunotherapy now. That could have helped. And even though it is in the guideline, you're correct, the guideline change. Oncologists who see multiple type of tumors cannot always be up to date with every tumor type. I'm narrow. I'm the only patient with gastrointestinal tumors. And even in that field, I do not claim to be up to date on everything that happened every month or every 6 months. But think about a general oncologist that sees everything from thyroid cancer to breast to colon to lung. It is challenging to be up to date on all the novel biomarkers and all the novel therapies that are geared toward one particular feature of the tumor. So I think AI will help greatly in oncology by being implemented in models of decision. It could be integrated in EMRs, electronic medical records, and there are many ways where this is beginning to be applied. So I think it will provide a more reliable compliance with state-of-the-art knowledge. That's through the example I just gave you, and there are many such examples, could probably be avoided or improved. Another AI application, which was recently launched throughout the McLaren healthcare system by Dr. Justin Clamaris, the chief medical officer, which is a very intelligent approach, is looking at all the CT scan we have throughout all the entire McLaren healthcare. And many patients they come maybe for pneumonia, they come because of car accident, they come because they are weak and people don't know what's going on, and we just get a CT scan. What he came up with, which is a very useful indication, is to look at the calcium score, which is how much calcium is wrapped around your coronary arteries, which you get for free when you get a CT scan because you are using the same approach. And what he proposed, and it is now implemented throughout McLaren Healthcare, is that patients who have a high calcium score will be recontacted and will be known. You visited our facility on, let's say, June 1st. At the time of the CT scan, we noticed that you had a lot of calcium in your coronary arteries, we would strongly recommend that you consult with your primary care or with one of our physicians to see what next step might be best for your health. And there you can apply multiple approaches. For example, lowering cholesterol. In some patients who have extremely high calcium score, they may need catheterization fairly soon. So you may avoid a lot of unnecessary death from cardiovascular disease just by using an AI recognition of a pattern on existing imaging without infringing on the patient's HIPAA rights, because you will just say, we found this. It's, of course, your own choice to decide if you want to take action. We would recommend you do. So I think that's another large-scale AI implementation that is already implemented throughout McLaren Healthcare, which I find very smart and helpful and will have immediate benefit for a large number of patients.
Yeah. I think it's amazing because it's not just, I think there's been a lot of talk about AI on productivity tools or workflow tools, but there's also AI on the clinical decision side or even the clinical development side. And so I think, AI is changing kind of every single facet of the value chain in cancer care. And the example that you gave, I thought was really interesting because it's just perfect marriage of using AI to do kind of a clinical task, looking at the CT scan for the calcium scores, and then combining that with almost like workflow automation to make sure that you're not just generating insights to throw on somebody's desk that's already overworked. You're also just being able to automate the work and improve the care while you're at it. It's such a great example. I'm curious, like when you're kind of evaluating these new ideas, what frameworks are you applying to decide, what to prioritize?
I think several guidelines are priorities. First, is it safe? Are you doing anything that could, infringe patients' HIPAA rights? What is the potential benefits to the patients? And can we make healthcare more streamlined, more effective for everyone? I think these are kind of the three principles that would guide, in my mind, how we should prioritize these various options with AI. So I think the applications really are endless. They are particularly helpful when you have repetitive work that could lead to human error. They are particularly helpful when you are trying to find the optimal treatment in oncology for a tumor type with a certain genetic makeup that may have been missed. You may have looked at the major one for which one drug exists, but you may not know of all the other one. A correlation between these findings and clinical trial available in the region where the patient lives, or if the patient has the ability anywhere in the country, providing options for patients. I think in terms of inpatient care, there is also a lot that can be done to facilitate error management. We know that everybody can make an error either typing or clicking on a computer. When you have an AI model that will recognize pattern and will identify verification, I think it could make our healthcare system more precise and less prone to errors. We know medical errors are still a major cause of morbidity and mortality in the entire world, not only in the US. So I would see AI as a major help in this field as well.
I think that's the perspective that we have at DeepScribe as well. We started with documentation, and we focused specifically on oncology just because of how nuanced we saw the workflows were. And I think because we were able to kind of customize the workflow to oncology specifically, that's why we've had so much success there, to the point where we're processing nearly half of the cancer visits in the US today. But from there we kind of expanded to more kind of productivity tools, right? These are like low risk, repetitive work, prone to user error. So we have, the billing encoding stuff that you said, and then also the pre-visit stuff, summarizing the documentation in the EHR. But the real strategy behind that is combining, these key workflow elements and evolving them to actually being able to provide, hyper contextualized clinical intelligence directly in that workflow, so that physicians would actually engage with those insights in a way that's actually actionable. And so it'll be really interesting, I think, to see how the evolution of these tools really work and what they converge, because as you said, right now there's so many different vendors out there, so many different use cases for AI. But ultimately, how do you actually integrate those AIs into one cohesive workflow for the physician so that they actually get traction? So it'll be an interesting thing to observe.
Yeah, indeed. It's a fascinating field of development and potential applications. I think obviously the major makers of EMR will have an advantage because they already are capturing most of the data generated through patient encounters. So we're talking about Epic, Cerner, to mention the two largest one in the country. But I think there is room for anybody to really enter this space, and we will ultimately, I think patient will benefit. Patient and healthcare provider will benefit from these applications.
So I'm curious, like from here, where do you think we go? Right, like if you were to wave a magic wand, is there anything that you would change about how the regulatory bodies work? Is there anything that you would change about how physicians are adopting AI to better accelerate the advancement of this technology? I'm curious, what would you do?
The major issue here is fragmentation of the market, because you have different EMR used by private practice, by hospitals, by individuals who want to see their data, whether on my chart, on various software. So I think an integration and intercommunication of the various EMR would be, to me, a prerequisite, like during the Obama year, where there was a mandate for moving to electronic medical record that really triggered the advancement of the US as a leading provider in the world of electronic EMR, where still many countries are using paper charts. I think that's a major leap forward. There might be a need for governmental intervention for interconnectivity so that we would not be split. I have some patients that are on Epic, some patients are on Cerner, and they need their cell phone at the consultation to be able to show you the data from the other system. That doesn't make sense in this day and age. So I think communication between the various EMR system, whichever they are, and I don't have any preference, I've worked with many of them, would be a big plus helping implementation of the application you are discussing.
Yeah. I completely agree with you. I think interoperability has been a problem in healthcare for years, and it's still unsolved. And I think one of the major bottlenecks for us to really reap the full potential of AI is to be able to leverage all the data that we have and put that into kind of one context window for the AI to be able to operate. I think right now it's like there's so many different fragmentations of where that data lives, how it's structured, and unless we actually solve that problem, it's going to be very difficult for us to, reap the full benefits of AI.
And I don't believe that the provider of EMR are going to self-regulate. I think this is where we need governmental intervention.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask you another interesting question, just kind of on that same train of thought. Like, I think interoperability is definitely something that will require kind of government intervention. But I'm curious, generally with these AI tools, with some of the efficacy data that's coming back, do you think at one point, leveraging AI as part of the care delivery process will be kind of like a mandate rather than just kind of a discretionary tool that individual physicians would be able to opt into?
I don't have a crystal ball, so it's hard for me to predict, but I think it could go either way. Either healthcare system will realize that they benefit so much from AI implementation that they will do that on their own. I think it may lead to saving in terms of salaries, because there are some jobs that may be repetitive that may be eliminated thanks to AI. I think in general, the government has taken a lot of steps that I think go in the right direction, which is quality of care, measuring really metrics for all hospitals, and we all have to show how compliant we are with key metrics of readmission, infection, and all this. So I think we have very good guideline and supervision in terms of making sure we're going in the right direction. If AI can help achieve these goals faster, I would predict that everybody gonna run with them because that will be a big advantage. We know that third-party payer will look at these metrics for reimbursement. It's already happening for several of the payers. So I think all this will trigger an implementation that may be faster than we expect because it will address some measurable goals of quality of care that will benefit everybody.
Yeah, I think if we can align on kind of a shared framework around, what is the true goal here? Like, how do we actually provide the best care to the patients? It'll really accelerate, the acceptance of AI into standard clinical practice.
Yes.
So, Dr. Pasche, I know we're almost out of time here, and we like to close every podcast, asking every guest the same question, which is, what is one thing you wish, technologists understood about oncologists? And what is one wish, that you have that oncologists would understand about technology?
Being on both sides of the equation, I don't have one particular wish since I've been an inventor, developer, as well as a clinician and administrator. I think I've been on both sides of the aisle. I think FDA regulations sometimes have been very strict and potentially overly restrictive. I feel that this is not the case right now. I think the FDA is really pushing for the development of novel technology and is very supportive of companies with novel technologies. Telling you, of my personal experience with TheraBionic with the FDA initially, it took almost a year and a half to have the FDA agree with our assessments that this was really a very low risk technology. And we had back and forth. We had some trial we were trying to start obtaining an investigational device exemption, and we were being told, no, it's dangerous for the brain. It is something that could. And then ultimately, through a meeting we had at the FDA was about 15 representatives, suddenly the lead person of this meeting say, oh, no, this is very low risk. You can immediately move to that. And I would say sometimes the regulatory authorities, when you have something novel, they would rather lean towards saying no because this is the safest approach rather than providing a feedback that helps you move forward. Ultimately, it took probably a good 2 years for us to go through this process. Ultimately, I found the FDA extremely collaborative and helpful. But I would say I'm thinking of other technologies that AI is one. I understand that it's always safety first and then efficacy. And when you come up with novel technologies, it may not be easy initially to separate the one from the other. But I think that would be my first dream or request, that we have probably a little more leeway for novel technologies so that they can percolate and benefit patient faster. That would be one thought. On the physician side, I would say if we could make the system a little bit simpler, EMR, document taking, integration of all the metadata we have. For example, as an oncologist, I have patients that I've been following, and now I've been 3 years at Karmanos, but I've had patients that I follow for 7 years. And you have a large amount of data, sometimes very bulky files that needs to be integrated. Having an integration of this data so that we could ask an AI application, when was this done? When was this? When you have notes in oncology, you sometimes see pages and pages of update of what has been done. It's virtually impossible for a physician to reread everything every time, but it would be quite helpful to have AI tools that are reminders that help you grasp the full history of a patient over the course of their diagnosis and treatments. That would be another wish that I would have.
Well, hopefully we get there soon. Hopefully next time I talk to you, TheraBionic is going to be across all the indications, and DeepScribe is going to transform into this clinical intelligence engine that we're building. So it's an exciting time to be in oncology.
It is. It is indeed.
Well, Dr. Pasche, thank you so much for your time today, and I really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you very much, Matt. Greatly appreciated the talk, and thank you for all the good questions.